Stoughton Media Access Corporation is pleased to present International Forum, a new cable show of interest, periodically interviewing foreign newsmakers, bringing them from across the ocean directly to your living room. Here's your host for this week's show, Joseph Feaster.
Hello and welcome to another edition of International Forum. Our topic again today is going to be Israel. Now, Israel, a country surrounded by those who wish that Israel did not exist, a country that has from its inception had turmoil, strife, but has survived and is intent to continue within the Middle East. Last when I was here having a conversation with our guest for today back in November, what we talked about and wanted to educate you on is the history of Israel, its geography. We talked about what had happened from its inception in 1948 and its first Prime Minister, Ben-Gurion. And we covered a number of topics of U.S. relations, what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Iran, what's going on in Egypt. And to further your education on this topic, we have come back once again to have a great guest, a well-informed individual. And my guest for today is Ambassador Yoram Ettinger. He served from 1989 to 1992 as a minister for congressional affairs at Israel's Washington, D.C. Embassy. He is a trusted member of the Israeli cabinet and Knesset. He is a thought-provoking thinker and writer who regularly briefs U.S. political leaders about U.S.-Israeli politics, bilateral projects, and Middle Eastern affairs. He is the editor of the Ettinger Report and executive director of A Second Thought, a U.S.-Israeli initiative dedicated to generating out-of-the-box thinking on U.S.-Israel relations and Middle East politics and that of Judea and Samaria. He resides in Jerusalem with his wife, Ora. So welcome, Shalom, Ambassador Ettinger.
Thank you very much.
I'm always excited to have this program with you, and I'm always pleased to host this simply because I learned so much in my dialogue with you, and I hope our viewing audience does as well. And really what I want to be able to first start with, I want to start with you talking about what prompts you in order to do these great missives that I've had an opportunity to read online in your Ettinger report. Can you give us a sense of what drives you in that regard?
Well, I've had a challenge for the last 30, 40 years, and it has to do with a litany of misperceptions characterizing Western policymakers and Western public opinion molders when it comes to their coverage or their assessment of the Middle East. And my challenge has been to bridge the gap between the misperception and the reality here in the Middle East. One of the examples has to do with U.S.-Israel relations. The misperception is that supposedly it's a one-way street. U.S. gives and Israel receives. The reality, at least of the last 20, 30 years, has been that of a classic two-way street. Obviously, the U.S. is by far the major partner, but this has been a two-way street partnership whereby increasingly, Israel has contributed to the U.S. both commercially as well as national security. And there are many other such misperceptions, and that has been the driving force behind my weekly articles, weekly documents, which I've shared with American and Israeli politicians, journalists, academicians, security, military people, as well as businessmen and the public at large.
And Ambassador, I want to, if you will, just push a little further on the comments that you made about the U.S.-Israeli relations, because I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that majority of the folks in the U.S. believe that it is a one-way street. We hear about the type of aid that's given to Israel, at least financially. We look at in a number of different ways in which that is accomplished. But as you have stated, and you provided me with some of your writings on this particular subject, both from the standpoint from a military and strategic location in the Middle East for U.S. involvements in the Middle East, as well as some of the technology from some of our business community, Israel has definitely supplied a lot, as you say, in this bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure, I'll share with you, with the viewers, listeners, my own experience from October 2013. I was invited to address a group in Birmingham, Alabama, and flying from Washington, D.C. to Birmingham, next to me was a young man in his late 20s. And I found out that he served a year in Iraq and then a year in Afghanistan. I asked him whether he had a chance to visit Israel, and he said he did, but not as a tourist, rather being a member of an elite American military unit. He said, just like any other elite unit on its way to Iraq or Afghanistan, so did his unit go through Israel. And in Israel, they spent 4 weeks training with Israel's top experts, dealing with car bombs, suicide bombers, the very lethal IEDs, the improvised explosive devices, the #1 killer of Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. And according to this young man, those 4 weeks in Israel made a world of difference in him and his friends coming back to the U.S. without a single fatality. It so happened that the following day in Birmingham, I had a meeting with the president of the Birmingham Southern College, retired General Mitch Krulek, who is a former commandant of the U.S. Marines. And we spoke about Iran and we spoke about Iraq. And then I asked him whether he had any experience with the Israeli Defense Forces while serving the U.S. military. His response was that everyone knows, so he said, that at Fort Leavenworth, which is the intellectual mecca of the U.S. Army, this is where they formulate the battle tactics for the U.S. military. According to retired General Mitch Krulek, former commandant of the Marines, everything which they do at Fort Leavenworth is based on the Israeli book, namely on Israeli experience, on lessons drawn from Israel's wars since 1948. The same evening, I was invited for a reception at the home of one of the state representatives in Birmingham, Alabama, and one of the guests was an active service, a U.S. Marine Corps officer. And once again, I asked him whether he had any experience with the Israeli Defense Forces, and he said every single day. And I asked, what do you mean every single day? And the response by that U.S. Marines officers was that he is a specialist in urban warfare. And the model with which, or upon which they practice, they train at the base, was built by the Israelis based on the experience of Israel fighting urban warfare against terrorists in Gaza and Lebanon. And according to that U.S. Marines officer, Israeli experts frequent their base and train the Americans, and once in a while the Americans come to Israel, where in the Negev, southern Israel, we built a special base only for Americans, and that's where Americans get their training, or some of their training, when it comes to urban warfare. So here you have three experiences which provide a very, very real symptom of that growing Israeli role in the two-way street, mutually beneficial, win-win type of relationship. When it comes to industry, I paid a visit to the plant of General Dynamics in Fort Worth, Texas, where they manufacture the F-16. And according to the plant manager, Israeli Air Force men who are on location at the base provide the manufacturers lessons drawn by the Israeli Air Force as far as operations, maintenance, repair under battle condition. And being a battle-tested laboratory, literally at the service of the American defense industry, according to the plant manager, more than 700 modifications have been introduced into the current generation of the F-16 complement of the Israeli experience. And according again to the plant manager, this is a mega billion-dollar bonanza for the manufacturer. I assume that a similar benefit is drawn by McDonnell Douglas, the manufacturer of the F-15. They are huge. There is a huge benefit drawn by the manufacturers of tanks used by Israel, armed personnel carriers used by Israel, night navigation, missile launchers, etc. Israel is employing over 1,000 U.S. military systems. So, of course, obviously, we are grateful for the U.S. to provide us with those systems. But one should bear in mind, once we use it, right away we share with the Americans the lessons drawn under battle condition. And this has expanded American exports. It has enhanced American research and development, and it has also expanded the employment infrastructure in the U.S. If one would walk into the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate in Washington, one would hear that the scope of intelligence received by the U.S. annually from Israel exceeds the intelligence which the U.S. receives from all NATO countries combined. Now, can anybody attribute a dollar sign there? We're talking about a very, very dramatic benefit to the U.S., which has dollar value, but most importantly, it has an impact on minimization of American losses, minimization of anti-American Islamic terror activities on the U.S. Mainland, etc., etc.
Well, let me ask you this, Ambassador, if I might, because I think you've outlined clearly that bilateral relationship and the two-way street between Israel and the United States is key and has been well formulated over the years. But my reading also tells me that it extends even beyond the United States, that there are many foreign governments that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have done this type of military training that you're talking about, but as well, in some of the writings that you've provided me with, you've also talked about even businesses. There are countries that have come in, or businesses from foreign countries that have come in to invest in Israel, to purchase Israeli businesses. So it's not only on the military intelligence, it is also from a business-to-business relationship where Israel has provided opportunities for other countries to prosper.
No, absolutely. But one should make it very, very clear. There is absolutely nothing similar to that which goes on between the American military forces and the Israeli military forces. Israel does not share its lessons so lavishly with any other country, quite frankly, because we don't trust them as much as we trust the U.S. When it comes to commercial industries, Israel is a site of research and development centers for some 300 American high-tech giants. The reason they establish research and development centers in Israel has to do with the brain power of Israel. In Israel, We have the highest per capita research and development concentration, 140 persons per 10,000 deal with research and developments in Israel. The US, by the way, is number 2 in the world. It's 85 per 10,000. And we all know there are many more 10,000s in the US than there are in tiny Israel. But such concentration of research and development centers has drawn the Microsofts and the Intel and the Facebook and the American Online and the IBM and Hewlett Packard, etc. As I said, some 300 such giants to Israel. And Israel has become the major pipeline, other than the US, which generates to American companies cutting-edge technologies, which once again have accorded the US competitive edge in the global competition. Obviously, Israel benefits from the fact that American companies invest billions of dollars in those research and development centers in Israel, but the US gets, I would say, very high return on investment when it comes to any dollar invested in Israel. The same thing goes for agriculture. We're talking about rough time in western US when it comes to rain, when it comes to water. Israel has experienced rough time when it comes to water from day one, because we are in a very, very arid region of the world. And because we have experienced rough time, therefore we rose to the challenge and we have developed very unique technologies in the area of irrigation, in the area of desalination of water, in fact, in the area of recycling sewage. In Israel, more than 80% of our sewage is recycled for agriculture, and we have reached water quality which fits to drink by human being. And that is a huge revolution, not only for Israel, which relies less and less on natural waterfalls, but again, we have shared that with some American companies, with American major American civic organizations, and we are sharing it with countries in Africa, countries in Asia, which just like us in Israel, do face drought, do face arid land problems, and we are sharing with them that which we have developed during the last 65 years in Israel. The same thing, by the way, goes for medicine. Just a few days ago, US and Israel concluded a memorandum of understanding, joining forces to advance research on medical problems facing pilots and facing people in astronauts in space shuttles. And again, we have that experience due to the fact that our Air Force is probably the busiest Air Force in more than any other free country. And we are very happy.
Let me ask you this, Ambassador, because I had the opportunity firsthand to witness what you mentioned about, and I was totally impressed because you had the opportunity to see that in a desert you could deal with the agricultural issues. And I was there in Israel and visited your country in 1984. Was very, very impressive. And again, as you've elaborated on here, Israel has been one who has outsourced many of its great technologies in so many areas. But I just want to shift for a moment because you also recently had a sad loss in the country. Former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon passed away, I believe it was last month, and he had been in a coma, as I understood, somewhere from about 2006, 2007. Can you tell our viewing audience the impact and the loss and maybe some of the history, because not only was the late Prime Minister served in that official capacity, but he was also one of the major generals at certain times with the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. So could you speak about the late Prime Minister Ariel Sharon a bit?
Well, certainly he has had a very unique personal history going back to the early years of the country during the 1950s. He was one of the key founders of our own special operation forces, and he was very creative, very daring in facing Arab terrorism, which has afflicted us from day one. It was General Sharon who, during the 1973, made the breakthrough and turned things around from what could be demise of Israel in the war of 1973 and shifted it towards a huge victory. And that shift was direct result of a very daring offensive by Sharon, who at that time commanded our armory in Sinai, and quite frankly, even against the instruction of his superiors, he decided to follow one of the most daring offensives. And in fact, recently I heard that American forces are studying that battle just in case the U.S. would face major tank challenges in some parts of the world. It was Prime Minister Sharon, when he became first Prime Minister, who put down in 2002 a huge wave of Palestinian terrorism, which consumed almost 1,000 Israelis. At that time, 201, 202, parts of 203, buses were blown up in the air in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem. Restaurants were attacked by Palestinian terrorists. Jerusalem was targeted by Palestinian terrorists, and it was then Prime Minister Sharon who decisively put it down. And in fact, since then until this very day, terrorism was subsided by roughly 95%. This is a very unique achievement by any historical perspective. However, Prime Minister Sharon became also part of a huge controversy, and that was his decision to uproot Jewish communities from the Gaza Strip and transfer the area to the control of the Palestinians. That was supposed to produce more moderation on the part of the Palestinians, more stability, more security, better economy for all sides, all concerns. Unfortunately, the Palestinians, in particular Arabs around us, did not share Prime Minister Sharon's assessments, expectations, and rather than respond in kind to his gesture of, mind you, uprooting thousands of Jews from their homes, by the way, flourishing homes, because Jewish communities in Gaza became a hothouse of flowers, of fruit, of vegetables, which were exported to Europe. All that was uprooted and given to the Palestinians. The Palestinians did not respond in kind, did not reciprocate, and instead they launched an unprecedented wave of terrorism. And in fact, until this very day, Jewish communities in southern Israel bordering Gaza are exposed sometimes even to daily shelling by the Palestinians from Gaza, who shell us from the sites where Jewish communities were uprooted with the hope of producing more moderation by the Palestinians.
Well, and that's a good segue, Ambassador, to the next topic that I want to do. And I'm watching. You were so informative, and I'm just watching the time just clip away. So I'm going to try to put a few things together and put some thoughts for you to discuss, and show that some of the facts related to it, but also some of the connections. And those are the Oslo Accord, which I know President Perez was very much involved in back in 2000, and I believe there's some discussion was once again had in 2013. The most recent World Economic Conference, which took place in Davos, Switzerland, and there was much talk about, because there's been much talk over the history of Israel and its relationship with its neighbors, particularly the Palestinians, of trying to find a way for some peaceful accords and some reconciliation and some divisions of land. And we talked a little bit about that last time. And lastly, if you could talk about, because now, well, then Senator Kerry, but now in terms of now within the government in his role as a secretary, Secretary John Kerry is now in the midst of the conversations about, once again, some peace accords between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Can you some way give a brief history of the Oslo Accord and its reality and relationship, what went on in Davos, and your assessment of what was stated? I believe, I forgot which one of the Palestinian leaders spoke, but that may come back to me, and I'm sure you know. And lastly, what is the U.S. position that's being pro-offered by Secretary John Kerry? And I know in some of your writings, you just think they're totally off base. So could you elaborate a bit?
Sure. The Oslo Accords, in my mind, should serve as a wake-up call to people who embrace very critical misperceptions about the Middle East in general and the Arab-Israeli in particular, because the Oslo Accords reaffirm the reality that the Arab conflict with the Jewish state has never been over the size of the Jewish state, but over the existence of the Jewish state. And here, if we go back to 1993, when the Oslo Accord was concluded, here was Israel according the Palestinians something which the Ottoman Empire never did, which the British Mandate never did, which Jordan, when it occupied Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, never did, which Egypt, when it occupied Gaza, never did. And here came the Jewish state in 1993 and provided the Palestinians with a unique gift, a unique opportunity, which again is unprecedented as far as attitude by Arabs towards the Palestinians. We imported some 60, 70,000 Palestinians from terrorist camps in Yemen and Iraq and Libya and Syria and Lebanon, in Tunisia, etc. And we basically offered them a new chance to change their lives. We provided them with full control of 40% of Judea Samaria, with the aim of increasing it towards 100% should things go in the proper way. And at the same time, we gave them the whole of Gaza Strip. Not only that, but the White House would not accept the Palestinian leaders until Oslo. Oslo Accords opened the White House to Palestinian leaders. Oslo Accord gave Nobel Prize to Yasser Arafat. How ironic, how sarcastic, maybe tragic, but this was enabled by the Israeli gesture. We legitimized Arafat in the free world. We also provided the Palestinians with weaponry and with ammunition. And what was the Palestinian reaction? First and foremost, unprecedented hate education instituted by no other than Mahmoud Abbas, the current Palestinian chairman of the Palestinian Authority. Secondly, and as a result of hate education, unprecedented wave of terrorism against the Jewish state, and then a systematic process of non-compliance with agreements. The result, by the way, was that the number of Israeli fatalities during the 20 years since Oslo is roughly 8-9 times than the number of fatalities before Oslo, during the 20 years before Oslo. When it comes to Secretary Kerry attempts at that time, it begs the question, has the Secretary indeed observed, examined the Middle Eastern reality before rushing into his mission, which I firmly believe, is very, very well intentioned, but at the same time, very much off course. It is off the Middle Eastern course for this very tragic reason. In the Middle East, we haven't had yet, for the last 14 centuries, comprehensive peace among Arabs, among Muslims. We haven't had yet compliance with agreements among Muslims, among Arabs. The last 3 years, which I call the Arab tsunami on the Arab street, and it's still a volcanic reality. The last 3 years shed light on the violent intolerance when it comes to intra-Muslim relations. And here comes the secretary and is telling Israelis basically that which the Muslims, the Arabs, have not yet accorded to each other, they are going to accord the Jewish state if the Jewish state concedes and retreats and appeases. I wish it would be so simple, but the fact is that Middle Eastern reality is much more complex, much more violent, much more intolerant than the secretary would like it to be. And as long as it is that way, Israel must remain very, very vigilant. And Israel must maintain a very high level of security threshold, or else we are not going to survive in that area. Middle East is an area, by the way, where you either enjoy the menu or you become part of the menu. And in order to avoid us becoming part of the menu, we must remain strong. And remaining strong and deterrent on one hand, and giving away the control over the mountain ridges of Judea, Samaria, West Bank, which dominate the sliver along the Middle East, 9 to 15 mile sliver, which is pre-67 Israel, that is oxymoron. Because if we go back to that sliver along the Mediterranean, which is what the secretary would like us to be, we are going to lose our posture of deterrence. And without posture of deterrence, we are going to lose the right or the privilege to survive in the Middle East.
Well, Ambassador, that brings me to the most recent conversation that took place, and this is in Davos, Switzerland, and this was at the World Economic Summit. And much has been written and said about what Iranian president, I believe his name is Hassan Rouhani, was saying. Do you care to comment on what you feel? I think the essence of his comments were that Iran is prepared to not to continue making nuclear weapons over a certain period of time. And there were a lot of, as I would say, platitudinous ponderosities that were given with regards to that, and there were comments on that. Do you have a view on what transpired at Davos, Switzerland, and also the comments of President Rouhani?
Sure. The Iranian president, in fact, reiterated that Iran is not going to give up, to suspend its pursuit of nuclear capabilities, claiming that this is the right of Iran. We should bear in mind, first of all, that President Rouhani is not the strong man in Iran. President Rouhani was handpicked by the so-called supreme leader of Iran, which is the Ayatollah Khamenei. Iran has been ruled since 1978-79 by the Ayatollahs, by the mullahs, very, very ultra radical, extreme Islamicists in Iran, and they picked Rouhani because of his capability to double talk. It was Rouhani who served as the chief negotiator with international agencies, who misled those agencies for the last 15, 16 years as far as Iran's pursuit of nuclear capabilities. He was on record, 2002, 2003, claiming that Iran has absolutely no interest to develop non-conventional capabilities. And here we are now at the last lap of the nuclear marathon by Iran. But much more significantly is that while the US, I think sadly, tragically, is now leading the campaign to legitimize the regime of the Ayatollahs and the mullahs in Iran, leading the way to engage Iran rather than confront Iran, while the US truly, genuinely believes that it would be possible to resolve problems with Iran through negotiation. Iran is assisting on a daily basis the Muslim terrorists who are killing Americans in Afghanistan. Iran collaborates as we talk with North Korea in developing ballistic capabilities which would enable North Korea and Iran to reach the US mainland. Iran is collaborating with the anti-American, radical, unpredictable regime in Venezuela. In fact, there are already Iranian missiles on Venezuelan soil. Iran is the chief sponsor of Islamic terrorism, anti-American Islamic terrorism. And Iran is a major force in terrorizing, in subverting the pro-American Arab oil producer in the Persian Gulf, most notably Saudi Arabia. And Iran, last and not least, is also the most vicious country as far as providing hate, anti-American education to its own kids. And here we hear that such a regime is indeed a genuine partner for a compromise, for a reasonable dialogue. Again, I wish that it would be true, but it simply does not make sense. And I'm afraid that the American policy towards Iran could transform Iran, which today is a controllable tactical threat to the US, to the free world, to Saudi Arabia, to Kuwait, etc. American policy could transform that controllable threat to become a non-controllable strategic nuclear apocalyptic threat.
Well, Ambassador, at the top of the program, I couched what is occurring in the Middle East with regards to Israel as a region of unrest, turmoil, and historical inability in order to get to any type of peaceful accords. Right around the country of Israel, there are things happening in some of the Arab countries, and I would like for you to talk about it and what's happening in those countries and their relationship and effect upon Israel. And namely, that would be the unrest that's going on in Syria. You've just talked about Iran and whether its role is to be moving towards peace with Israel or not. And certainly what's the unrest that's occurring in Egypt and its impact. That's on, and as I set the stage for the geography of the country once again for our viewers, we have Lebanon to your north. We have, Syria to your northeast. You got Jordan to your east, to your west. You have Syria to your northwest. You have Egypt to your south. And so when we look at those dynamics, the unrest in those countries, what impact, if any, will they have or are they currently having on Israel?
Well, on one hand, it makes the anti-Israel camp that much weaker. They are preoccupied with their own domestic and intra-Arab and intra-Muslim rivalries and wars and terrorism, and therefore, obviously, it makes them weaker when it comes to threatening Israel. But on the other hand, it does present a very dangerous possibility that in fact, to our east, where we have today a relatively stable neighbor, namely the Hashemite regime of Jordan, that could easily, within one bullet, be transformed into an Iranian controlled country. It could be transformed into Muslim Brotherhood controlled country, and the Muslim Brotherhood are the transnational Arab terrorist organization. It could be transformed into Al-Qaeda dominated, or it could be transformed into Hamas, PLO, radical Palestinian dominated neighbor, rather than the moderate pro-American stable Hashemite regime. We have in Egypt right now a military regime, and as much as it sounds non-democratic, but a military regime means more pro-American, more stable, less hostile than the Muslim Brotherhood regime, which was there only a year ago. But things are very shifty in the Middle East. In fact, the only thing which is predictable in the Middle East is unpredictability. And therefore, we realize that we are bordering a ridge of volcanoes, and the lava may not be contained within the Arab country. It may sweep beyond their borders and could also reach Israel. Jordan, for instance, is very, very panicky because they are concerned that the Syrian lava will sweep Jordan as well. Saudi Arabia is restless. They are restless, or they are sleepless, I would say, because they know very well a nuclear Iran may doom the House of Saud to oblivion, as it would Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Kuwait, and other pro-American regimes. So we are surrounded by a very, very concerned, worried bunch of conservative Arab regimes, which are their days could be numbered, and they could be replaced by much more radical, very hostile, very anti-American regimes, which could undermine our security, which brings me back to what I mentioned before. We have to be ready, not for the best case scenario, we must be ready for the Middle East scenario. And the Middle East scenario ranges between the bad, the worst, and the worst. There are no such things as good scenarios in the Middle East. There haven't been throughout the last 14 centuries. And in this context, by the way, once again, Israel is featured as the only ally of the U.S. upon which the U.S. could count. We are the only stable and reliable and predictable and effective and democratic and unconditional ally of the U.S. I don't believe there is such an ally in the Middle East or beyond the Middle East. And at the time when the U.S. retreats due to its own priorities, at the time when the U.S. cuts the defense budget due to the U.S. own priorities, the question is, who is going to bridge the strategic arm of the U.S. in the Middle East, while the U.S. arm is getting shorter and shorter. The only element in the Middle East which could extend the strategic arm of the U.S. in an area which is vital to American interests is Israel. And therefore, U.S.-Israel relations are much more significant, much more contributing to America's own interests than any time before.
I always appreciate both your being as informative and certainly your candor with regards to these relationships that the Israelis have or Israel has with its neighbors. I want to come back once again to the discussions that took place in Davos, Switzerland, and particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu's response, if you will, to the statements from President Rouhani from Iran. And in essence, it seems like his comments parallel yours, that there's a basic distrust that what President Rouhani is stating as far as Iran's new position is not to be trusted. Could you speak about that a little bit?
Well, I would compare it to a daily experience, whether it's in Massachusetts or in Israel. Would anybody conclude a deal with a potential partner whose track record does highlight lack of credibility, treachery, subversive activities, non-compliance with agreements? Obviously, we would not even sit down with such a potential partner. This is exactly what Iran has been all about during the last 30 years, since the Ayatollahs and the mullahs have taken over. We are talking about a partner from which we wouldn't buy a used car. And here we're concluding a nuclear-related agreement. It seems to me that what many Americans are misperceiving here is the very simple fact that it's not Israel, but the U.S., which is the primary target for Iran. For sake of discussion, we can eliminate Israel today from the Middle East. This would not change at all Iran's decision to develop nuclear capability, because the reason for this pursuit by Iran has nothing to do with Israel, irrespective of Iranian anti-Israel rhetoric. The Iranians have always harbored what I call a mega historical goal: to dominate the Persian Gulf. In order to dominate the Persian Gulf, they have to remove a mega obstacle. That mega obstacle is not Israel. We're not a player in the Persian Gulf. The mega obstacle, as far as the Iranians are concerned, is U.S. power projection in the world, in the Middle East, in the Indian Ocean, and especially inside the Persian Gulf. The U.S. is there because the U.S. is the only stabilizing force, the only force which reduces insanity in the world, but that acts against the megalomaniac aspirations of Iran. And therefore, in order to advance their mega historical goal and be able to remove the mega obstacle, they are now developing a mega capability, which is nuclear. And should they acquire that capability, that would doom the pro-American Arab oil-producing countries of the Persian Gulf, which would cause havoc to the supply of oil, to the price of oil, and once again would devastate the American economy. A nuclear Iran would boost Islamic terrorism also on the mainland. You have today hundreds of sleeper cells, Islamic terrorist sleeper cells in different U.S. locations. You can imagine the impact on them by having not conventional sponsor, but rather nuclear sponsor. And certainly it would embolden Venezuela, which is already a very, very problematic reality for America in America's own backyard. And Venezuela, with a nuclear ally, would cause much more headache to America's homeland security as well as national security. And last and not least, a nuclear Iran would erode dramatically the US posture of deterrence. And that would be a traumatic nightmare for the US, for the free world, and for the entire world. And therefore, as I mentioned before, the current agreement, which has been forged by the US with Iran, could indeed transform a controllable Iran to a non-controllable nuclear apocalyptic strategic Iranian threat, which would dwarf the insanity which today we experience in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East.
Well, Ambassador Ettinger, with the few moments that we have left, I want to revisit a subject because, as you've outlined it, it appears that the U.S.-Israeli relationships are key to basically quelling some of what could happen as far as terrorist acts throughout the world, but particularly in Israel as well as in the United States. I want to come back once again to what Secretary Kerry is pro-offering as far as the peace settlement issues. And you provided me with a fairly strong letter from former Israeli Ambassador Baker, Alan Baker, on that particular topic, and some other articles that you've written about. Is there any demography that's being pro-offered by Secretary Kerry, and talking about whether what he is offering is whether it is a good idea or not. Could you, in the few moments that we have, elaborate on that once again? Because I want folks to understand exactly what your view is and basically what has been presented by even former Ambassador Baker.
Well, again, I don't think we have few moments. We may have 1 or 2 minutes due to my own timetable here in Jerusalem. However, the fundamental assumption is wrong. And the fundamental assumption by Secretary Kerry is that Israel should cede land and the Arabs would reciprocate with peace. There's a problem with that, because rarely has land for peace been implemented in settling conflicts throughout human history. Usually, the belligerent loses territory and the intended victim either gains territory, but certainly does not cede territory. We had that case at the end of Second World War. Nazi Germany was forced to cede land to France and Poland and Czechoslovakia, and in return they were given the opportunity to live in peace. Today we have a diametrically opposed land for peace concept, because what we are being told here, that the Arabs who have terrorized and assaulted Israel repeatedly since 1948 should get from Israel land which was taken by Israel during wars launched by Arabs, and by ceding land to the belligerent should moderate itself. It seems to me that, logically speaking, if you want to moderate a belligerent, you should punish the belligerent. You should not reward belligerents. And for the Secretary to offer, and for many Israelis, by the way, to assume that land for peace could moderate the Arabs is an exercise in futility, because we have seen it again and again that territories, that the concession of territories has not brought us closer to peace, but further for peace. In 1993, Oslo Accords Israel gave the Palestinians more land than they ever received before from any entity in the world. And in return, as expected, by the way, we became targeted for more Palestinian terrorism, because that is what happens when you reward belligerence. The assumption that a human being chased by a shark would moderate the shark by providing the shark a piece of his or her own flesh does not match reality. Once the shark tastes your blood, the shark pursues you with much more eagerness. And so it is with Land for Peace in the Middle East. The only way that peace could be achieved is by stating to the belligerents, you shall not be rewarded for your belligerence. In fact, you shall be punished. And should you attempt belligerence one more time, you will be punished even more severely. This is sadly the opposite message from the secretary, who is telling the Arabs, don't worry, you tried to decimate Israel, you failed, but you will still get territory concessions from Israel. This is not the way to produce a closer peace. This is a way to get us farther from peace, closer to more terrorism, more wars, and maybe most importantly, it's an evidence that some people are determined to learn from history, not by avoiding mistakes, but rather by repeating mistakes.
Well, Ambassador, you have taken me almost to the last minutes of our program today, and as always, what you impart is so informative and is a good representation of what is going on in the Middle East. I would invite our viewing audience not to only view this program, but to really go back and look at the program that we had in November, because it puts it in context. You have to know your history. You have to know the history to understand and to put in perspective what Ambassador Yoram Ettinger is saying. So, Ambassador, my seconds are drawing down here. I just once again want to thank you so much for making this such an excellent and informative program. I know you are there in Jerusalem, and I am here in snowy Stoughton, but nonetheless, I want to wish you and the family well. And I want to say Shalom Shabbat.
And come to Jerusalem. There's spring around here, an all-time high flow of tourism. There are still some rooms for those of you who want to come. And I wish everyone a very pleasant, challenging, and rewarding weekend. And Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Bye.
This is Roy Cohen, producer and director of the International Forum Show. Thank you for watching, and we welcome your comments to our email address, international.forum@yahoo.com.